Turn-based combat is old. It's outdated and it's a dead-end mechanic with no future innovation. Simply a circumstance of technical limitation, there is no place for turn-based games in the modern gaming climate. Or is there? What I've just said are common arguments that are often tossed around in the modern JRPG community. Of course, I think this is nothing more than folly, and at worst, it's borderline deceptive. Let me paint a picture for you. Let's go back to the early days of computer role-playing games. There were very strict technical limitations bound to the hardware that these games had to run on. Certain mechanics arose from this time that were indeed due to technical limitation and not part of the inherent vision of the designer. This is what is important to keep in mind, however, the intention of the designer. For an example of this situation, we can look back to the classic adventure game Myst. Development of Myst started in 1991, and at the time, there was nothing else like it. CD-ROM technology allowed larger game files and media to fit onto computers, and Myst planned to take advantage of this to the full extent. The game world was fully rendered in real-time 3D, but this quickly revealed a problem to the team. While the technology for rendering this world was there, the computers of the time simply couldn't handle real-time 3D graphics to that extent. So, what was the solution? Pictures or frames of the game world were taken and then imported into a drawing software where they were touched up and then connected via hyperlinks. So rather than moving around the world in real time, the game was essentially a series of slideshows that you would interact with, clicking on the screen to go to new locations on the map. The intention was always to be able to fully explore the worlds of Myst, but hardware limitations at the time required a concession to be made, and this kind of point-and-click movement was born. Now, this style of movement is a valid mechanical decision, but it's a concession between the vision of the designer and the hardware available, and it only exists because of a technical necessitation. What I'm getting at here is that turn-based combat in the early CRPGs was not a result of technical limitation, but rather a fully thought-out and intentional mechanic. So how can I say this so confidently? Well, my logic is quite simple. The earliest computer role-playing games were imitating a very specific set of mechanics. These mechanics, of course, originate from Dungeons & Dragons. Wizardry, Ultima, Might and Magic, all of these early CRPGs owe their DNA to the foundations laid by the systems in D&D. Hit points, variable weapon damage, methodical exploration of dungeons, resource management, and turn-based combat, they all came from here. So I find it very easy to dismiss the argument that turn-based combat is simply a product of hardware limitation because it comes from a much older source. Now, you could argue that D&D itself is a result of technical limitation, but that logic only goes so far. So it isn't a limitation set by the computers at the time because it's referencing an even older set of mechanics. So turn-based combat is clearly not an outdated mechanical decision in the same way that board games are also relevant gaming experiences. You can call them old or traditional, but they've stuck around for a reason, and the primary reason is because they're fun. So what do I find fun about turn-based combat, and why should you care? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that turn-based games give you time to think. Obvious, right? There are many different types of games that appeal to all different aspects and approaches of tone and mood. Action games have their place and their appeal, as do story-driven experiences and cinematic games. A large part of the appeal of turn-based games is that their inherent nature forces you to slow down and think about every encounter. Now, as an individual, you may not find this as interesting as I do, and that's valid, but I think it's important to recognize that this is indeed a part of the large appeal. Some of the traits I love in turn-based combat do not apply to every game that features this style of gameplay, but when handled optimally, I think some of the most satisfying moments and experiences in gaming as a whole come from sequences that are unique to this style of combat. Optimally, I think that normal encounters should be quick, snappy, and responsive, but at any moment you're allowed to stop and think carefully about your moves. This stage of planning your attack is one thing that I love the most. Wizardry is a very good example of what I think fun combat is. It almost feels like a game of chess. You're presented with a group of enemies, all of whom have specific attack patterns and spells that they can use. You have to find out the best way to counter these moves and send out your own attacks. Combat happens in phases, so you choose all of your actions at once, and then the game executes these in the order of initiative. So the best moments happen when you successfully parse what the enemy is trying to do, and you preemptively shut them down with a planned series of commands. It is in these moments in between rounds where you're thinking about the best course of action that brings me the most satisfaction. So optimally, a well thought out turn-based system like this is like a delicate puzzle box. Every encounter is a tangle of specific patterns that have to be parsed and unraveled carefully by the player. Now, with all this talks of turns and thinking, you may get the impression that combat becomes dreary and boring in comparison to, say, well, an action game. This is not inherently the case. Some of the most tense moments I've had while gaming have come from games with turn-based inputs. Moments like those found in games like NetHack, where you find yourself running down a hallway from a powerful monster that you know you can't fight. Your HP is low, and you see that you've just cornered yourself. The monster is right in front of you, and you have to stop and search through your inventory looking for some kind of solution to the problem. Maybe you have a scroll that you can read, or some kind of combination of potions that you can throw at the enemy. These moments of intense concentration are a direct result of the nature of the combat that forces you to stop and think about every move you make. So, while turn-based combat is not fitting for every game, it does still have a place in the modern gaming climate. Of course, it's fine to dislike certain styles of games, but to dismiss all games that have a turn-based system as uninteresting, well, that seems a bit silly to me. The label action game is very broad and can apply to anything from Doom to Mario 64. Likewise, the turn-based umbrella is very large and encompasses a huge variety of gaming experiences. That being said, they all share that same appeal of making the player slow down and feel the weight of their decisions. Everyone has their own preferences, and there's merit to each of these. This just so happens to be my style, and it deserves to be preserved. So thank you for listening to me, and stay fresh out there, guys.